Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. This last week, Prime Minister Mark Carney appointed Senator Pierre Moreau to be his government leader in the Senate, and I figured I would talk a little bit about what that role and what it's supposed to be and what it's become and why that's a bit of a problem. So the government leader in the Senate is supposed to be the government's point person in the Senate chamber. And they do things like make sure that the government's legislation is shepherded through the process, but they also do things like be the point person to answer for the government during Senate question period, because the Senate also has its own question period. And instead of asking the Prime Minister, they ask the government leader whatever the question is, and then he or she will have a book of briefing materials for which they will usually have some kind of a response that they will deliver at the moment, or as is more common in the Senate, they will take the question under advisement and get back to that senator with a written response at a later date. Happens much more often in the Senate than it does in the House of Commons because you don't have relevant ministers in the chamber for the most part. But this is generally the role the government leader has filled. And for just about the entire bulk of Confederation, with a few exceptions, up until a few years ago, the government leader was always a minister, or a member of cabinet, so a de facto minister. Didn't necessarily have a key portfolio, although occasionally they would be given another portfolio as well. But generally, they were always a member of cabinet for a couple of reasons. One of them is that it entitles them to cabinet confidences and being able to sit in on discussions, so that when they're answering in Senate question period, they were at the table and they know what they're talking about. And it's also an avenue for accountability. And there are people who mistakenly believe that the Senate can't hold government to account because it's not a confidence chamber, but that's a very limited view of what accountability means. You don't need to be a confidence chamber to be able to hold the government to account. You can simply use other tools, like just basic questions and being able to bring things to light in that particular way. That is still a valid form of accountability that does not involve bringing the government down. And so if the government leader is a member of cabinet, then he or she answers on behalf of the government, meaning cabinet, because they are a member. And that's an important thing to consider. But then things changed in around 2013, 2014-ish, around the time of the cluster duff scandal. And that was when we had a whole thing about senators who were reducing expenses, as typified by then Senator Mike Duffy. And he was not the only one, but he was the most emblematic because he also went to trial for it. But there was a whole series of these spending scandals, and then Prime Minister Stephen Harper, also because he had lost at the Supreme Court in his attempt to do Senate reforms in his particular way without a constitutional amendment, he was in a fit of pique and decided he's going to wash his hands of the Senate. And then when his government leader at the time, who was Senator Marjorie Le Breton, hit her retirement age, his next replacement as government leader, he did not name to cabinet. And that was his way of trying to distance himself from the scandals that were happening in the Senate. But for all intents and purposes, even though that government leader was not in cabinet, he was still a member of caucus. He was still essentially in the fold. So it did not, he didn't have the same access, but he still had the same ability to be briefed and so on. And it was slightly more symbolic in that regard that he wasn't in cabinet, but it's still an important consideration that your government leader is in cabinet. But then Justin Trudeau happened. And a couple of things, when shortly after he became party leader, he expelled all of the senators from the Liberal caucus, again, to inoculate himself from this ongoing spending scandal, because there was an Auditor General's report coming out, and he wanted to get out ahead of that. And so he kicked all of the senators from his caucus and dressed it up in this whole thing about how he wants them to be more independent and so on, even though senators were already pretty independent because the Senate is built around institutional independence, and they didn't really get whipped in the Senate because there's no levers for which you can really exert to force them to vote any particular way because of the way the Senate is structured and their institutional independence. And so it was more of a PR exercise than it was about genuine independence. It was really about his getting out ahead of this Auditor General's report, but it also, in the same way, centralized his own power within the caucus, because within the caucus room, he no longer had a group of people who were not beholden to him. And senators in a caucus room can push back against a leader because they don't have to worry that he's going to sign their nomination papers again before the next election. So they can speak truth to power within the caucus room a whole lot more than any of the elected MPs can. And Trudeau made sure that they were no longer able to do that. So it was not only about the optics of the Senate scandal, but it was also about his trying to centralize his own power within the caucus. And he also pushed through changes to the party constitution, which centralized his power within the party. And that's a whole other mess, which we will talk about again in the future and have talked about many times in the past. I've written column after column after column about this. But yeah, this was all about centralizing power, and senators were, to an extent, the victims of that. But getting back to the government leader. So Trudeau had already expelled all of his senators from caucus, and then he won an election and formed government. And he did not have a group of Liberal senators who would be amenable to becoming his government leader, because they were all extremely upset with him for the way in which he, with no notice, kicked them out of caucus one morning. And they were all particularly still upset with him, and nobody volunteered to become his government leader. And so he chose one of his newly appointed senators, Peter Harder, to be his government leader. And then became a whole series of problems because Harder was an independent, but also the government leader. And it created this weird, half-pregnant state of affairs. You cannot be both the government representative and independent. Like, that does not work. You represent the government, you are the government. You may not sit in the caucus, which is the real issue here. And they contorted themselves into what they're going to call themselves, and they've settled on non-affiliated, which, is not really, it's just perpetuating this fiction that they are not part of the government, even though as the government leader, he is representing the government in the chamber. And as the government leader, he gets briefed by Privy Council office as to, the issues in the government. He can attend cabinet meetings if he needs to, but he is not a member of cabinet and cannot actually properly answer on behalf of the government as a result. And this perpetuated when Harder stepped down as government leader and Mark Gold was appointed to the position. Same thing happened. And Gold has just retired and now has been replaced by Senator Moreau. And Mark Carney has opted to carry on this same particular style, or this same particular working arrangement, where the government leader is not a member of cabinet, which I personally think is a mistake. It it lessens the ability of the Senate to hold the government to account in a meaningful way. And it's the half pregnant thing I just find is particularly farcical in terms of how you run a democratic chamber. We have government and opposition in our parliamentary institutions for a reason. And this kind of makes a bit of a mockery of that. And we have to remember that the entire purpose of Parliament is to hold the government, meaning the Prime Minister, the Executive, the Cabinet. The whole point of Parliament is to hold them to account, not just the House of Commons, also the Senate. And by not having someone in the Senate who can answer for government, you reduce the ability of the Senate to hold the government to account. Now, in the Trudeau era, they did create some slight innovations, like they would invite a single minister in for Senate question period, often once a week, and they would answer all of the questions for that particular special question period. Again, that creates a bit more sense of accountability, but it should not have been that way because the government leader should still be a cabinet minister. And even if they don't want a caucus of Liberal senators, which I also think is a mistake for the very reason that we articulated earlier, in that not only can they push back inside the caucus room against a government, but they are also the institutional memory, which is an incredibly important function to have. But again, so even if you did have a government leader with no caucus in the Senate, at least if they were in cabinet, they would still have that ability to properly answer on behalf of the government. And I know that they don't they don't want to be able to say that, oh, we have no Liberal senators, because they would still have one in the government representative. But again, you get back to that half pregnant thing, which we really should not be entertaining. Like, we should not be letting people and governments in particular come up with these fictions in order to justify ridiculous decisions that they make like that. So yeah, this is a bit of a sense of what the role is supposed to do. In terms of shepherding legislation, it's also about communicating back to the government the timelines and the needs in the Senate, which essentially is, if you want these bills passed by this certain date, you need to give it to us by this particular point in time so that we can do our work. And this is being increasingly abused because more and more, particularly in the last 5 or 6 years, when we have had nothing but constant procedural warfare in the House of Commons, you get a dump of bills sent to the Senate at the very last week because the House of Commons couldn't pass them to that point, because usually the Bloc or the NDP would not play ball until the very end, when they realize that, oh, maybe we want to get these bills passed after all because we have an interest in them. So things would get dumped on the Senate at the very last minute. And also, normally this would not have been a problem in the previous times, when senators would sit another week or two into the summer, or much closer to Christmas, to pass those bills. No, under Peter Harder and then Mark Gold, they would rise at the same time as the House of Commons, under the fiction that, oh, well, there's no point in us being here if the Commons isn't here. No, you still have a point because you still had work to do. So again, a competent government leader who was able to be in cabinet and communicate these things effectively, and not have to go through the Minister of Democratic Institutions or whatever Justin Trudeau had designated as the point person for the Senate. then yeah, you would have better flow of communication and better idea about the needs of senators in terms of getting that legislation passed at the times that they wanted it passed. But no, they wouldn't do that because, this fiction about, oh, we're making them more independent. No, you're just creating more problems for everybody. And creating problems where problems did not exist because it was politically inconvenient for you. So we'll see what Senator Moreau does when he's in the role, and whether he carries on some of the more problematic traditions of his two predecessors. But this was a choice that Carney could have made, and he could have ensured that Moreau was a member of cabinet, so that the Senate can properly fulfill its accountability functions. But he did not, in part because I think Carney does not properly appreciate the functions and the roles of Parliament. And the people around him who should know these things are not speaking up about it, or are not properly convincing him that it is important for him to care about these things. And so this half-pregnant farce will carry on for however much longer it's going to. So, as you can tell, I've got some strong feelings about this. And we'll see how this all plays out in the next while. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter, and journodale _, on Bluesky. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.